Walter woke up at 6:12, as always. He hadn't used an alarm clock since Marlene passed away nearly a decade ago. His body had learned the right time, as if obeying an invisible clock lodged somewhere in the left lung. He sat on the bed without making a sound, even though he lived alone, slipped into his slippers with his feet, stood up with a soft crack in his knees, and walked to the kitchen counting the steps. 7 to the light switch, 5 more to the coffee maker. All in the dark. He made the coffee with mechanical movements. The paper filter, 2 level scoops, water boiled in the iron kettle he never replaced. The toast was pre-prepared from the night before, a dry French roll, halved, left on a plain white plate. No butter, no salt, nothing to complicate digestion. He sat at the table and looked out the kitchen window. Not because he liked the view, but because it was what he did. The fogged glass showed the building across the street, a skinny palm tree, and the gray sky, always gray. The house was completely silent, broken only by the dripping coffee and the wall clock ticking as if mocking the life that never changed. At 6:57, Walter put on his navy blue wool coat, adjusted the worn brown cap on his head, and walked to the door. He locked it with 2 turns of the key, even though he knew no one would enter. Pressed the elevator button at 6:58. The display flashed 4 for a second. It was on the floor above. At exactly 7, the elevator doors opened. And there she was, again, the girl from 502. She carried 2 fabric bags slung over her shoulders, a thermal cup in her hands, and a smile on her face, the kind of smile that seems to ignore the existence of Mondays. Her hair was tied in a messy bun, and headphones hung around her neck. "Good morning," she said, stepping in. Walter didn't reply. He merely nodded, almost imperceptibly, like recognizing a distant neighbor on the street. She went on, "The elevator always smells like coffee around this time. That's you, right?" Walter kept his eyes on the lit panel showing the floors. The ground floor button was already pressed, but he pressed it again, just in case. "I like it. The smell. Reminds me of my grandma. She used to make coffee and put a dish towel over the lid. Do you know that custom? Not sure if it's an old thing or just in my family." She spoke as if his silence were just part of the conversation, as if she were used to monologues. "Sorry, I talk too much," she said, laughing, as if hearing herself for the first time. The elevator reached the ground floor. She held the door for him. Walter hesitated, then walked slowly. He didn't thank her. She didn't wait either. She stepped out quickly, leaving behind a trace of citrus perfume and the feeling that something had happened, though it was hard to say what. Walter walked to the front desk, picked up his newspaper, gave the doorman a dry nod, and stepped out to the street. The morning cold was sharp. The sidewalk was wet from a recent drizzle. He looked at the sky. Gray, of course, always gray. Turning the corner, he noticed his shoulders were tense, as if he'd carried something in the elevator he couldn't name. He muttered to himself, like he did when the coffee came out weak. On the sidewalk, a black cat crossed his path. Walter stopped, looked at the animal, then at the newspaper in his hand. It was crumpled. He didn't remember squeezing it. He returned home an hour later as always. But this time, upon entering the elevator, he noticed a strand of blonde hair caught between the buttons, and for some reason he couldn't explain, he left it there. Emily stepped into the elevator with her hands full, 2 cloth bags and a thermal mug. She wore worn-out sneakers, the kind that show the life of someone who walks a lot, and a long-sleeved shirt with a small teddy bear embroidered near the heart. Walter was already inside. He had pressed the ground floor button before the doors had fully opened, not out of urgency, but out of habit, and maybe a bit of hope to escape. "Good morning, Mr. Walter," she said, smiling. He was surprised, not by the greeting, but by the fact that she knew his name. He didn't reply. "Did you know today is International Coffee Day?" she continued, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "Heard it on the radio while I was doing the dishes. I like those silly little holidays. Feels like they give meaning to the small rituals, you know?" Walter kept his eyes fixed on the floor indicator. The glowing ground floor button was like a silent vow. "I know, I talk too much. Always have. My mom used to say I should study law or radio. I ended up in nursing. Go figure, right?" She laughed at herself. Walter didn't. "There was a patient yesterday who gave me a bonbon, one of those with liquor inside. I don't even like them, but I ate it so I wouldn't seem rude. Spent the whole afternoon feeling a little tipsy. Can you believe that? She let out a short, genuine laugh. Walter pressed the ground floor button again. The elevator beeped, annoyed at the repetition. I guess I'm talking too much again, huh? Emily said, looking at him. This time, he shifted his gaze from the display. He looked at her hands. They were red, marked by the weight of the bags that seemed heavier than they should have been. She held the thermal mug in one hand, and in the other, keys dangled from a felt keychain with a blue letter E. I like talking to you. You listen, she said, her voice quieter, even if you don't answer. Before Walter could think of a reply, the door opened. A neighbor entered, Mr. Miguel from 301. He wore a beret and suspenders. Good morning, he said. Emily replied. Walter didn't. The elevator reached the ground floor. Emily held the door for both men to exit. Walter hesitated but followed Mr. Miguel out without a word. As they passed through the glass doors of the lobby, Emily tripped slightly. The wool glove she was carrying fell, but she didn't notice. Walter looked back. The glove lay on the beige elevator floor, solitary like a forgotten secret. He bent down, picked it up, and put it in his coat pocket. Outside, the cold was sharper than the day before. Walter walked in silence to the newsstand, bought his paper, and took a longer route home than usual. He didn't know why. Back in his apartment, he took off his coat, hung it over the kitchen chair, and took the glove from the pocket. He stared at it for a few minutes. It was gray, fraying at the edges with a small hole in the thumb, too small to fit the hand of someone who carried so much. Walter opened the drawer next to the sink and placed the glove there, between masking tape and matches. That night, he had breakfast again, just out of habit. And in the dark, before falling asleep, he wondered if she would talk the next day about the missing glove, and if she would miss it. The next morning, Walter woke up the same way as always, but there was something different in how he placed his feet on the floor, as if trying to feel the carpet before stepping. He drank his coffee, ate the dry toast, and spent a little longer looking out the window. The city was covered in a thin mist, the kind that makes everything feel suspended in time. The glove was on the table. He picked it up before leaving, put it in the pocket of his coat, as if carrying something important, though he hadn't yet decided whether to return it. In the elevator, he found Emily. She rushed in, carrying only one bag this time and her usual thermal cup. Good morning, Mr. Walter, she said, as if continuing yesterday's conversation. He responded with a slight nod. Did you see a gray glove anywhere? I think I dropped it yesterday. People say it's distraction, but I think it's just tiredness sometimes. Walter hesitated. Then, with restrained movements, he took the glove from his pocket and handed it to her. Emily gave a broad smile, the kind that warms up an entire room. I thought it was gone for good. Thank you so much. She put the glove back on her left hand, adjusting her fingers carefully, like putting on a memory. You know, I bought this glove at a thrift store, paid 2 reais for it, but I've used it so much it already knows the way home. Walter didn't reply, but looked at the glove with quiet interest, as if he finally understood it mattered. The elevator reached the ground floor. Emily held the door for him. He stepped out first, this time with a slight tilt of the head. On the sidewalk, the wind was sharp. Walter walked to the newsstand, but didn't buy a paper. He just looked at the headlines for a few seconds and then returned the same way. Upon entering the building, he passed Mr. Miguel, who said something about the cold. Walter responded with a guttural sound that almost resembled a yeah. He took the stairs, just one flight slowly, and once home, he placed his coat over the chair and mistakenly pulled out the glove again. He'd forgotten he had returned it. But now in the pocket, there was something else. A crumpled paper with some random flyer he must have picked up on the street without noticing. He looked at the chair, then at the drawer where the glove had been. The masking tape and the matches were still there, untouched. That afternoon, he cleaned the window glass with an old cloth, something he hadn't done in months. And as he did, he saw Emily on the sidewalk. She was on the phone, smiling and gesturing with her left hand, the one with the glove. Walter watched, unhurried. The cloth stopped moving for a few seconds. Then he finished the cleaning and went back inside. That night, he went to bed before 10 p.m. No need for radio, no need for newspaper, And for the first time in a long while, he dreamed of Marlene. She wore gloves too, but hers were red. The elevator was quieter than usual that morning. Emily stepped in a bit more slowly, the dark circles under her eyes revealing a restless night. She carried the same cloth bag and thermal cup as always, but her steps lacked energy. Walter, already inside, noticed out of the corner of his eye. She took a deep breath before speaking, as if summoning the courage to face the day. I woke up 3 times last night. Grandma's been confused. Gets up in the middle of the night thinking it's morning. Today she asked where my grandpa was. He died in '92. Walter stared ahead, but his right eyebrow arched slightly. Emily didn't notice. Her name is June. Pretty, right? Kind of old-fashioned. I think it suits her. This time, Walter blinked a little slower. His jaw moved as if he were chewing on a memory. She raised me. I lived with her since I was a kid. When my parents died, she said I was the best thing that ever happened to her, even when I messed everything up. Emily laughed, but there was sadness in her voice. Walter let out a sound that could have been a not an answer, but something. Do you take care of anyone? She asked, turning slightly toward him. He shook his head. Oh, I thought maybe you had a wife or grandkids. Walter pressed the elevator button again, even though it was already lit. Emily bit her lip, regretting the question. Sorry, I talk without a filter sometimes. Must be the exhaustion, or the missing. She pulled a bottle of aspirin from the bag and checked the expiration date. It was expired. Walter noticed. If you want, I can bring a new one. I've got an extra at home, she said. At the hospital, we always have something left over. He didn't answer, but as they exited the elevator, he looked back and gave a small nod. Barely there. On the sidewalk, Emily walked away slower than usual. Walter stood still for a few moments, watching. The wind tugged at her hair, loose beneath the messy bun. At the newsstand, Walter bought the paper, but left it unopened beside his coffee, untouched, as he looked out the window. Later, he found a brand new box of aspirin in the cupboard, still sealed. He placed it on the top shelf in plain sight and spent the whole evening thinking about whether he'd leave it at her door. The next morning, he went down 2 minutes early, just to see if she'd come down too. It was supposed to be just another morning. Walter was already in the elevator at 6:59, cap adjusted and coat buttoned up to the top. Emily rushed in, holding her thermal cup and a plastic container of food. She was out of breath. Almost missed it, she said, smiling. This elevator's always so punctual, like it has a soul. Walter didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth seemed to hesitate for a moment. The doors closed. The elevator began its usual smooth descent. But as it passed between the 3rd and 2nd floors, a sharp crack echoed. The lights flickered, and everything stopped. Emily let out a startled breath. Walter took a half step back as if that might help him escape the metal box. Oh no, not now. She pressed the ground floor button. Nothing. Tried the emergency one. Silence. The dim emergency light came on, casting shadows on the walls. This hasn't happened before, has it? Walter slowly shook his head. Emily began speaking faster, as if the speed of her words could manage the anxiety. I've got a patient who needs antibiotics by 7:30, and Grandma's with the neighbor. She doesn't like the neighbor, says she gives her nasty looks. She laughed nervously. I'm okay, really. It's just that I don't like tight spaces. Walter stayed silent, but looked at her directly for the first time. Emily was trying to hide her panic, but her hands were trembling. She sat on the floor, breathing quickly. When my parents died, I locked myself in the hospital bathroom for 2 hours. I couldn't come out. Since then, elevators remind me of that day. But I keep using them because, I don't know, it's just an elevator, right? Walter slowly pulled a small bottle of water from his pocket. He handed it to her without saying a word. Emily accepted it, took a sip, then looked at him, her eyes glassy. Do you always carry this bottle in your pocket? He nodded. Still no words. Thank you. The silence between them was different. Not awkward. Necessary. They stayed there for nearly 40 minutes. Emily seated on the floor, Walter standing, leaning against the wall. Sometimes they looked at each other. Sometimes they just shared the air. When the elevator finally started moving again, both of them adjusted themselves as if nothing had happened. The doors opened on the ground floor. Emily clutched the container a little tighter. Walter adjusted his cap. See you tomorrow? She asked. her smile calm. Walter answered with a steady gaze and an almost imperceptible nod. She stepped out first this time. He stayed behind for a few more seconds. The elevator doors closed slowly, as if it understood that time in there had changed. Walter walked down the sidewalk with tense shoulders. The newspaper under his arm was untouched, but he hadn't read a single line. His eyes, usually alert to the details of the street, a pot out of place, a new crack in the pavement, now seemed empty, as if searching for something he couldn't name. At the front desk, the doorman mentioned something about the morning blackout. Walter simply nodded and went inside without a word. He took the elevator up. Alone, he didn't press any button for a few seconds, just waited. The doors closed. The elevator began to rise. He sighed. In the apartment, everything was in its usual place. But for the first time in years, that seemed to bother him. The kitchen chair was 1 centimeter off from the table. He pushed it in, then pulled it back, repeated the motion, distracted. He opened the drawer where he kept his water bottle. It was empty. He grabbed another one, filled it, and without thinking much, slipped it into his coat pocket. Habit, perhaps, or necessity. The next day, he went down 2 minutes early. Emily didn't show up. Walter stood in the elevator, holding the button to keep it from going up alone. He waited until 7:03, then released the button. The door closed with a dry sound. When he reached the ground floor, he looked around. Her absence was louder than any conversation. The next morning again, silence. On the third day, Walter found a small folded envelope tucked into the elevator frame. He looked around. No one nearby. He took the envelope and read it. "Thank you for listening when I could only speak. Emily." No other signature. No detail. He read it again, then slowly folded the note and placed it in his wallet, between the yellowed photo of Marlene and an old birthday card written in her hand. He sat on the couch and stayed there for long minutes. That night, he didn't turn on the television, didn't read the paper, just sat, wallet in hand, running his fingers over the note like caressing an absent presence. The next morning, he went down at 6:58 again, and at exactly 7, the elevator doors opened. Emily was there, tired but smiling, as if she had fought through exhaustion just to be there at that moment. Walter stepped in, didn't say anything, but the silence this time had a different texture. And when she gently rested her shoulder against his, he didn't move away. It was Sunday. The building was as quiet as an empty waiting room. Walter came down a few minutes later than usual, unhurried. The newspaper hadn't arrived yet. He approached the front desk and found the doorman crouched, trying to coax a black cat out from under the bench in the lobby. "Showed up early this morning. No collar," the doorman said. The cat looked at Walter and for a brief moment seemed to size him up. Walter huffed, as if personally offended by the feline's presence. As he turned to enter the elevator, he heard footsteps behind him. Emily. She wore an oversized sweatshirt and slippers. She carried a bag of cat food and a sack of old newspapers. "Oh, there he is," she said, smiling. "I left some food out yesterday. Looks like he liked it." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You don't like cats, do you?" He didn't answer, just pressed the elevator button harder than necessary. "I named him Mr. Poe, like Edgar Allan Poe. I thought it was dramatic, matches the way he looks at me." In the elevator, the cat wrapped itself around Walter's leg before the doors closed. He tried to push it away with his foot, unsuccessfully. Emily laughed. "He likes you." Walter muttered something inaudible. "You know, Mr. Poe showed up the day Grandma started getting worse. Since then, he sticks around. People say cats can feel when something's wrong." Walter looked at the animal, now lying at his feet, motionless like a rug. Then he looked at Emily. She looked thinner, or maybe just more hollow. On the ground floor, the cat stepped out first, paused at the building entrance and looked back as if waiting for someone to follow. Emily waved goodbye. Walter didn't respond but stood watching as she walked away. Later that day, he came down again, carrying a saucer of milk. No label, no declared intention. The cat wasn't there. Walter placed the saucer under the bench and returned to the elevator. In the elevator mirror, he saw himself with his cap crooked. He adjusted it calmly, then noticed a strand of black fur on the sleeve of his coat. And for the first time, he didn't try to brush it off. On Monday morning, Emily stepped into the elevator with a folded piece of paper in her hand and the look of someone who hadn't slept well. She wore the same sweater from the previous Friday, and her hair looked hastily tied. Walter was already there, standing in the corner, water bottle in his pocket. "Good morning, Mr. Walter," she said, offering a tired smile. He nodded. "Grandma hasn't been sleeping. Me neither." She raised the paper. "Made this shopping list in the middle of the night just to try to organize my mind. I need to stop by the pharmacy, but I'm not sure I'll get out of the hospital in time." Walter looked at the list for a second, then looked away. Paracetamol, gauze, neutral soap. Emily spoke like she was venting. "Seems like a simple list, but everything feels heavy when you're tired, right?" Walter didn't answer. But when the elevator reached the ground floor, he waited for her to step out first. Emily hesitated, surprised, and smiled. That afternoon, she came home later than usual from the hospital. She climbed the stairs with half-open eyes, carrying a bag with hospital meals. At her door, she found a white bag hanging on the handle. Inside, the items from the list: paracetamol, gauze, neutral soap, all neatly packed. No note, no name. Emily looked around. The hallway was empty. The next day, she stepped into the elevator with a gold-wrapped chocolate in her hand. Walter was already there. She handed him the chocolate without saying anything. He took it, put it in his pocket, stayed silent. "You don't want to know why?" He shook his head. "Good," she said, "because I don't know either. Just felt like it made sense." The elevator stopped. The door opened. The cat was sitting there, staring at them, as if waiting for a reply. Walter stepped out first. Emily followed. The chocolate stayed in his pocket all day. He only ate it that night when he couldn't sleep. It was a little melted, but still sweet. Walter was leaving his apartment when he heard voices in the hallway. It was Emily, talking on the phone. Her voice was tense, lower than usual. "I can't pay right now. Do you understand? I work all day, I take care of my grandma, and now I have to deal with this too?" She took a deep breath. "I'm doing what I can, but I can't promise the impossible." Walter stopped, stood behind his door, listening without meaning to. "No, there's no one else. Just me and her." The quiet hallway was broken only by her voice. Then, footsteps. She hurried down the stairs. Walter opened the door slowly. The hallway was empty, but something in the air had shifted, as if the entire building had heard. Later that night, he went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As he passed the door, he heard a muffled sound. He opened it gently. Emily was sitting on the floor, leaning against the hallway wall. The cat lay beside her. She wasn't sobbing, just staring ahead, like she no longer had the energy to think. Walter hesitated, then sat down on the other side of the door. Without saying a word, just leaned his back against the wood like she did. They stayed that way for a while. The hallway silent, lights off. The cat lay between them, a quiet bridge. Neither of them looked at the other. When Emily got up, it was nearly morning. Walter had already gone back inside, but when she opened the door, she found a glass of water on the floor. And next to it, one aspirin. It was Sunday. Walter came down earlier than usual, feeling a restlessness he couldn't name. When he reached the ground floor, he saw Emily at the building entrance with an elderly woman with white hair, delicate skin, and confused eyes. It was June. She wore a floral dress and a scarf around her neck. She sat on a bench, looking around as if waiting for something very important. Emily stood up when she saw Walter. She wanted to get some sun, said she wanted to see the birds. She smiled. June looked at Walter intently, then smiled. "Robert?" she asked, her voice fragile. Emily was about to correct her, but Walter simply nodded gently. "Yes, June, it's me." She smiled, touched his hand, and began telling a disjointed story about a garden that had never existed in that building. She spoke of flowers, of children running, of the blue dress she wore when she got married. Walter sat beside her. Emily sat on the other side. The cat appeared and jumped into June's lap, and she laughed like a little girl. "That's Sunday," she said, stroking the cat. Emily looked at Walter. He understood. That was the name she used for the cat when her grandmother was around. They spent nearly an hour there. Emily offered tea in a thermal cup. Walter accepted. They didn't talk much. The breeze blew softly, and time seemed to pause. In the end, June fell asleep right there, her head resting on her granddaughter's shoulder. "It was her best Sunday this year," Emily said softly. Walter looked at her and replied, "It was mine too." When they stood up, June was still asleep. Walter carried her gently to the elevator. Emily held the cat, and for a moment, the elevator mirror reflected what looked like a family. The doors closed slowly, without hurry, as if they knew that moment was worth keeping whole. On Monday, the elevator went down empty. Walter stood still for a few seconds after the doors opened on the ground floor, as if waiting for someone who was just running late. But Emily didn't appear. On Tuesday, the same. The elevator's silence felt colder. Walter pressed the ground floor button, and then, without thinking, the button for the 5th floor. When the door opened, he didn't step out. He just looked down the hallway for a few moments before letting the doors close again. On Wednesday, the cat was lying in front of Emily's apartment door. Walter crouched, ran his hand over the animal, and the cat didn't move. There was something there that didn't need words. At the front desk, he asked the doorman, "The girl from 502, is she okay?" The doorman looked up, surprised to hear Walter's voice. "She went to the hospital. Her grandmother got worse." Walter nodded. And that very evening, he picked a different cap, cleaner, newer, and went out. He walked to the neighborhood public hospital. He knew the way, but not the details. He had never paid attention. At reception, he didn't ask for anyone. He just sat in one of the chairs and waited. He saw Emily in the distance, carrying a tray. Exhausted, shoulders low, eyes sunken. He sat in a corner, got a cup of coffee from the vending machine, and left it on the table in front of him. Next to it, he placed a napkin. On it, he wrote in his stiff handwriting, 7 a.m.? The next day, the elevator doors opened at exactly 7. Emily was there, worn down but smiling gently. Walter stepped in. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said, "Thank you for coming," and his silently said, "I couldn't not." The elevator rose in silence. Walter and Emily stood side by side, as always, but there was something new between them, a comfortable pause, the kind of silence that doesn't demand explanations. "She slept almost the whole day yesterday," Emily said softly. "Sometimes I think she's already somewhere else, just waiting for her body to allow it." Walter nodded. He didn't know what to say, and that seemed enough. "When all this is over, I think I'll still wake up at 6, even without a reason. The body gets used to it, right?" He looked at her for a moment longer than usual, then turned back to the elevator display. On the ground floor, Emily held the door but didn't step out. Walter stood still too. "Do you need anything from the pharmacy?" she asked. "I'm stopping by after my shift." Walter hesitated, then shook his head, but as he stepped out, he said, almost in a whisper, "Thank you." She smiled like someone receiving an unexpected gift. They walked together to the newsstand. Emily spoke about medicine shortages, about patients who get better and then worse again. Walter listened in silence. "I like walking slowly," she said after a while. "When we walk slowly, the world seems to breathe." Walter didn't reply, but his steps had already slowed without him realizing it. The cat appeared at the corner, quietly following them. Emily crouched to pet him. "He only follows people who aren't in a hurry," she said, without looking at Walter. They continued walking, side by side, saying nothing more. And when they reached the building gate, Emily said, "Tomorrow at 7? Walter looked at her, then at the cat, and answered with a simple nod. It was enough. The next morning, Walter stepped into the elevator and found a card taped to the mirror. It was small, handmade, with letters drawn in blue pen. "Gratitude lives here." He read it, frowned slightly, then looked at his own reflection. The message felt directed at him, though it was clearly meant for everyone. Emily stepped in 2 floors later. She saw the card and smiled. "Someone started the day inspired, huh?" Walter stayed silent, but his eyes returned to the mirror. Emily said nothing more. The next day there was another one, a smaller piece of paper, handwritten. "Good morning to those brave enough to begin again." Walter looked at Emily. "Is it you?" She shook her head, laughing. "Swear it's not, but I think it's lovely." The elevator began to come alive with new phrases each morning. Some were optimistic, others funny, some cryptic. The neighbors started mentioning them in the hallways. One night, Walter took a piece of paper and with his shaky handwriting wrote, "Thank you for speaking when I didn't know how to listen." The next morning, the note was taped to the mirror. Emily stepped in and read it quietly. She didn't ask anything, just folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her bag. That day, the elevator lingered longer than usual on each floor, as if savoring each arrival and departure. Emily and Walter stayed until the top floor, even though neither of them needed to go that high. And when the elevator descended again, their hands were empty, but their eyes were full. On the ground floor, Emily gently held Walter's arm as they stepped out. He didn't pull away and didn't need to say a word. The hallway was quieter than usual. Walter stepped out of his apartment after hearing a muffled sound. It was Emily, sitting on the floor, leaning against her front door, the cat in her lap. Her eyes were swollen but calm. He approached without a word, sat down beside her. "She went this morning," Emily said, her voice steady. "In her sleep, just the way I hoped it would be." Walter nodded slowly. They sat in silence. "She used to call me Little Bird," Emily said. "Said I was light, even when I felt too heavy to get out of bed." Walter stared ahead, then said quietly, "Marlene used to call me Stone. In a good way," she said, "because I was steady, but I know it was mostly stubbornness." Emily smiled. "I loved when Grandma got things mixed up. Yesterday she called me her sister. I pretended I was. She was happy. Funny how we laugh at things when time runs short, right?" Walter looked at her with restrained tenderness. "On Marlene's last day, we just sat in silence. I wish I'd said more, but maybe she already knew. Women always seem to know before we do, don't they?" Emily nodded. The cat purred softly. She placed something in Walter's lap, a photo. The three of them on the bench downstairs, her, Walter, and June. On the back, a handwritten note, "Thank you for being part of my safe pause." Walter said nothing, but held the photo carefully like someone holding an inheritance. That night, he opened his wallet, took out all the old papers, kept only 3 things: Marlene's photo, Emily's note, and now the photo of the 3 of them. And he slept with the wallet on his chest, as if finally he was carrying everything he needed. Walter woke up before the alarm. In fact, he didn't use one anymore. His body simply knew. He got up slowly, slipped on his slippers, and walked to the kitchen. The radio stayed off. The kettle whistled softly. On the table, his wallet. He opened it carefully and took out the photo of the 3 of them. Placed it next to his cup, like a quiet companion. At 6:40, he put on his blue coat and brown cap, ran his hand over hair that was no longer there. In one pocket, the water bottle. In the other, the gold-wrapped chocolate Emily had given him days earlier. Still there, still intact. He left his apartment at 6:55. The elevator was already on his floor. The doors opened automatically, as if sensing his presence. Emily was there, standing as always. Her hair looser, eyes tired but steady. She smiled when she saw him. Walter stepped in. Neither of them said a word. The door closed slowly. On the second floor, the elevator stopped. The cat stepped in, settled between them and lay down, as if it were normal, inevitable. On the display, the numbers descended slowly. 3, 2, 1. Walter looked at Emily. She looked back, and in that quiet moment, everything settled. Nothing needed to be said. No goodbyes, no promises. Only the quiet certainty that sometimes a home can be built in the space of an elevator, and that some encounters, even brief, stay forever in the form of small, repeated gestures. Like pressing a button at 7 a.m., the doors opened, and the world outside waited in silence.